Random House Audio presents The Power Broker, Robert Moses and the Fall of New York, by Robert E. Caro, Volume 2. Read for you by Robertson Dean. Chapter 21. The Candidate. There had been a day in 1934 on which the cheering had stopped. It was the day Robert Moses started running for governor. Moses was later to maintain that he had not wanted to run. The Republican nomination was more or less forced on me, he was to say. He had accepted it only to hold the party together. Such loyalty to the grand old party is difficult to reconcile with the fact that Moses had spent 10 years of his life, the decade during which he worked for Al Smith, fighting it. Such loyalty is difficult to reconcile with the fact that in 1928, when Moses had believed he had a chance to win the Democratic gubernatorial nomination, he had enrolled as a Democrat. He had not re-enrolled as a Republican until 1933, when he needed GOP support for the Fusion mayoral nomination. And in fact, no reconciliation is necessary. For if Moses' description of his attitude is based on his memory played him false. No forcing was necessary at all, says F. Truby Davison, who first offered him the nomination. I had a talk with Bob and asked him if he'd be willing to go. He didn't say yes, but he encouraged me. Says another source, Bob told me Truby had offered him the nomination, and he asked my advice. My advice was not to take it, but I could see he was going to take it no matter what I said. He was hungry for it. The identity of the man who offered Moses the nomination is perhaps the clearest proof of the inaccuracy of the portrait Moses had painted of himself as the foe of the forces of influence, privilege, and wealth. For Truby Davison was the acknowledged representative of those forces. Son of J.P. Morgan's late partner, Henry P. Davison, heir to Henry P.'s estate, which, behind massive iron gates and thick walls of stone, occupied all 4,000 acres of Long Island's Peacock Point. No longer the naive young assemblyman who a decade earlier had been tricked by Moses into introducing the bills giving the Long Island Park Commission the right of condemnation by appropriation, Davison was a key figure in the ranks of the Long Island robber barons. And Davison was taking an active interest in the selection of the gubernatorial nominee, precisely because the barons felt that their influence and privilege, and to some extent their wealth, were threatened. The barons, together with the upstate gas and water power utility interests, had dominated the state's Republican Party from time immemorial. To a large extent, in fact, the GOP was the barons and the interests. A fact made clear when H. Edmund Machold, stepping down as Assembly Speaker in 1925, became, simultaneously, state GOP chairman and president of the gigantic utility holding company Niagara-Hudson, and by the fact that among the downstate GOP congressmen were Robert Lowe Bacon, stipendiary of the House of Morgan, Ogden Livingston Mills, son of Darius Ogden Mills of the San Francisco bank ring, and willowy millionairess Ruth Baker Pratt, widow of one of the 6 sons for whom Rockefeller partner Charles Pratt had built manor houses on the Glen Cove Peninsula. It was important to the interests that they control the state GOP. It was important for business reasons. The party was the interests' traditional protector in Albany, and it was important for reasons that went beyond business. The conservatism of these men of property, to whom property rights were sacred, was not only financial but ideological, and they viewed their party as a bulwark against heresy, against the increasing emphasis on human as opposed to property rights that characterized the philosophy of the 3 Democrats, Smith, Roosevelt, and Lehman, who had usurped the executive chamber. Public reverence for their beliefs might be dying, but they would never surrender them. Not for nothing had journalists dubbed them the Old Guard. From the standpoint of both philosophy and pocketbook, in 1934, control of the state GOP was more important to the Old Guard than ever. Their fury at the New Deal, the purpose of the Roosevelt administration is the imposition of a Russianized form of government, snarled upstater Bertrand H. Snell, House Minority Leader, had led them to resolve that the presidential election of 1936 would be a holy crusade to oust that man from the White House, and they intended to make New York, with its 45 electoral votes, the crusade's embarkation point. Moreover, most of the old guard, anybody who amounted to anything in the GOP, Warren Moscow said, owned Niagara Hudson stock, whose value would be immensely increased by the finalization of the scheme that had been the party's grail for almost 4 decades, the turning over to private utilities such as Niagara Hudson of the immense water power resources of the St. Lawrence and Niagara rivers. Smith had established a state power authority to keep those resources in the hands of the state's people. Roosevelt had pointed out dramatically that only 2 heartbeats, his and that of Lieutenant Governor Lehman, separated the power trust from the state's water power, and millions of New York families from higher monthly electric light bills. Lehman, as governor, had proved even more effective, undramatically but stubbornly shoving down the legislature's throat bills giving the State Public Service Commission authority over utility rates, forbidding the use of utility funds for political lobbying, and, in a step the utilities viewed as particularly ominous, allowing municipalities to construct their own plants and distribute power at low rates. Only the legislature stood between Lehman and still more radical anti-utilities measures he was proposing. It was vital to the old guard, more vital than ever, that the GOP control the legislature, and that they control the GOP. But control of the party had been snatched away from the old guard by the former amateur in politics they had once betrayed, but who had acquired from his bitter fight with Robert Moses a professionalism that made him their equal, W. Kingsland Macy. Macy had lost the Taylor estate fight, his first political battle. He had not lost another one. Having learned the hard way the importance of public opinion, he purchased a string of weekly newspapers that blanketed Suffolk County, and by 1927 had ousted the county GOP chairman, installed himself in his place, and purged the county organization with a ruthlessness so complete that his control of it would not be seriously challenged for a quarter of a century. Then he turned his attention to wider spheres. Before the barons quite realized what was happening, he had seized the Republican state chairmanship. Once in power, Macy proved that pince-nez, starched high round collars and blue suits with vests, the outfit he was to affect until he died in 1960, were no guarantee of conservatism. Attempting to reverse his party's blind obstructionism to progressive policies that had been largely responsible for the repeated victories of Smith, Roosevelt, and Lehman in a state in which voter registration was heavily Republican, Macy excoriated GOP legislators who opposed Roosevelt's attempt to blunt the effects of the Depression through increased spending, and embarrassed enough of them into supporting the state's temporary emergency relief administration to give the measure the votes it needed to pass. Dismissing the fear of the old guard leaders that, if they authorized an investigation of corruption in New York City, Roosevelt would authorize investigations of corruption upstate, Macy called GOP legislators into closed-door caucuses in Albany, and, using every ounce of patronage at his command, broke the power of grim old William Ward, and forced the tyrant of Westchester to release his legislators to vote as they wished, thereby allowing the passage of the bills initiating the Seabury investigation. And it was pressure from Macy that persuaded Republican fusionists to bow to Seabury's demand and, over old guard objections, give the nomination for mayor to the dangerous rabble-rouser La Guardia. Astounded and antagonized by the course on which Macy was leading their party, the old guard was thrown into panic by his next announcement, pointing out, accurately, that the GOP's identification with the Power Trust was a political liability. Macy proposed to end the trust's domination of the party by making Seabury, who had long attacked utilities as monopolists and exploiters of the people, its next gubernatorial nominee. "Well, that was all we had to hear," Truby Davison would growl 3 decades later, sitting with one gouty leg propped on a footstool in the 30-foot-high study of his mansion on Peacock Point, topping off with cherries.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?